but they will. If people can't see the screen, I'm assuming there will be some stuff popping up in the chat. All right, we'll get started, and anybody who pops in a little bit later can catch up on the recording afterwards. So, hi, as was just said, my name is Amy. I'm based in Perth, so hi to everyone out there from Perth, if you've already managed to get started or if you're still coming home from work. But I also originally come from Queensland. I grew up in Queensland, so big hello to all of the Brisbane peeps as well. I'm a little bit disappointed I haven't managed to tie in a she codes thing with coming to visit family at any point yet. And my clicker has stopped working. All right. Quick thing about this session is I would really love if you ask questions. I know this is an online thing. Don't want to ask questions. You're probably eating dinner or cooking dinner or dealing with bedtime schedules in the background. But if anybody does have any questions, I would love if you could ask them. If you don't want to ask the question, feel free to just type it in the chat and I will answer it. This session, it's really important and we really love to be able to hear what you're interested in knowing more about rather than just the stuff that I think is important, because there could be a question that somebody else has but they don't want to ask. Second of all, I want to make a quick disclaimer. Getting into the realm of accessibility, there are at times when we're talking about legal precedences and requirements. So depending on where you are or what industry you're working in, there may be times when you're legally required to meet certain criteria or to meet a certain standard. I'm not a lawyer, I cannot advise on those levels. So if that is a situation that might affect you, whether now or in the future, recommend having a chat with any people that you work with and just find out whether there's anything in particular you need to be concerned about. Now, I'd like to start this session off with a wonderful quote by Tim Berners-Lee, which is, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." What does it mean when we say we want to make things accessible? What does it mean for us as the people who are creators of the technology? Whether that's software or hardware or something else, means that anybody can use and interact with it using whatever means they prefer, given whatever capabilities they have. It means the internet, the technologies, and the solutions that we create being made for everyone and with everyone in mind. I want to also quickly cover something about what is ALI or A11Y. You will often hear it said as ALI. Now, ALI is a shortening of the word accessibility. This is an alphanumeric abbreviation where accessibility has 11 letters between the A and the Y, so shortens to ALI or A11Y. Another commonly used one is internationalization, which has 18 letters between the I and the N, and so shortens to I18N. So if you ever hear somebody talking about ALI, they are likely talking about accessibility, which is different than if somebody is talking about an ally, which is somebody who's generally advocating for accessibility. So what is ALI? As we just mentioned, accessibility means that people can use and interact with a thing, whether that's a place, an experience, a piece of software, hardware, technology. It means they can interact with it, they can use it. Anybody is able to take part. Now, this means anybody, no matter what disability or impairment they may have. And when we think of disabilities and impairments, a lot of the time people will think of cases like this. They will think of people who might be missing a limb, people who use a wheelchair, or somebody who is blind or deaf. This is what people will most commonly think of when they're thinking of impairments. But a lot of the time, impairments more closely resemble something like this. Somebody who might have an arm in a sling and therefore have limited or no mobility of that limb for a period of time. It might be a parent who's holding a child, and again, they have limited mobility or access to that limb for a period of time. Or it might be somebody who's trying to use their phone or their laptop outside and they have glare on the screen. Has anybody tried to use their phone outside and they can't read anything because of all the glare? These are all examples of impairments that accessibility helps us benefit for. The secret is everybody benefits from accessibility. This isn't a people with permanent impairments. Every single person will benefit at some point in time from an accessibility improvement. So have a think about if you've ever had a broken arm, if you've ever had an ear infection and you had limited or no hearing in one or both ears, parent holding a child, this gives you limited access to one or maybe both limbs. Maybe you're holding two children. Have you ever tried to use a device outside in the sunlight and there's a lot of glare? Have you ever tried to watch a video or listen to some kind of audio in a loud room and you're unable to understand what is being said? Have you ever wanted to watch a video in a public place or an office and you realized you didn't have headphones and you didn't want to be that person on the train who's watching a video with no headphones, because no one wants to be that guy. People with dyslexia or dyscalculia benefit from accessibility improvements, same as anybody with ADHD or anybody who might have difficulty concentrating, anybody who might have English as a second language. We will have a look at some of the cognitive impairments which make it more difficult or to take more to interact with and understand content that is going on web pages. Having difficulty concentrating, or where English or the language that you're consuming is not your first language, can make that more difficult. Maybe you've ever had carpal tunnel or developer elbow. These are a lot of real world, commonly occurring scenarios that can benefit from accessibility improvements. When we're talking about impairments, we generally break them down into three different categories: permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. Sorry, my office gets the afternoon sun and I generally don't notice until the point where it gets way too hot and then I have to try and frantically cool it down. We break impairments up into permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. Permanent impairment, as the name suggests, is something that generally will not be resolved in the long term. So this is someone who is permanently blind or deaf, or who has a missing limb or is in a wheelchair. A temporary impairment is something that cannot be resolved straight away, but will generally resolve in the short to long term. Now, this could include something like somebody who has an arm in a sling, somebody who has an ear or an eye infection. This isn't something they're able to resolve straight away, but it will in the short to long term resolve. Lastly, we have situational impairments. As the name suggests, these are a result of the situation alone. So it could be somebody who's holding a child or multitasking and has limited access to one or both of their arms. It could be somebody who's in a loud location and so they have difficulty hearing. It could be somebody who's outside in the sunlight and they have difficulty seeing because of the glare. These are situations which are a result of the situation alone and can be resolved by leaving it. Impairments are then broken up into 4 different categories. Vision, which affects the vision, either partial or full vision loss. Mobility, which affects both the use of and the control over any limbs, so arms, legs, and even hands and fingers. So if you have limited dexterity, or if you think of any grandparents who might have limited control over their hands or dexterity with their fingers, that comes under a mobility impairment. Hearing impairment, as the name suggests, affects full or partial hearing difficulties, including the use of a hearing aid. And lastly, we have cognitive impairment, which covers a wide range of different impairments and includes things like difficulty concentrating or consuming information. It includes epilepsy or severe migraines, and a vast range of other things come under cognitive impairments. Now, how many people are we talking about when we talk about impairments? Now, Australia alone, permanent impairments, we have about 17% of the population with vision impairments, 6% with hearing impairments, 2.6% with cognitive impairments, and 5% with mobility impairments. This equates to just over 30% of the population with permanent impairment. So this is something that is not likely to be resolved in the short to long term. Add on top of that, we also have temporary and situational impairments. That's way too many people who can benefit from accessibility improvements that we're not taking into consideration. There's a lot of missing data on this as well. A lot of countries just do not collect data on this kind of thing, or the data isn't broken down. So this number is very likely much, much higher. To make things easier for us to make things more accessible, we have a set of guidelines, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, often referred to as the WCAG Guidelines, even though technically that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's the same as an ATM machine. We will often refer to the WCAG Guidelines. Now, these are currently at version 2.2. Version 2.2 came out end of last year, and version 3 is being worked on at the moment. These guidelines are updated to include changes to different technologies. For example, some of the guidelines brought out changes with touch interfaces when we started having touchscreen devices, around animations and games and things like that. The WCAG guidelines have 3 different levels of conformance. Level A is the bare minimum. This means that something is mostly accessible, but not necessarily convenient for persons with impairments to be able to use. Most sites will meet this level. Next, we have AA, which is the general standard. This is a balance of ease of use for users with impairments and ease of development. If you are looking to make your website accessible, generally this is the standard that you are working towards. Lastly, we have AAA standard. This is the highest standard and is generally required to be met by anybody who's building a site for people with impairments or disabilities. This level is also often needed to be met by various government departments. So if you work for any government departments, or even if you work closely with government departments, it's worth checking which level you need to be met, that needs to be met. So how can we make things more accessible? How can we as developers make things better for anybody with an impairment, including ourselves, because at some point in time, it will make it easier for us. The first thing that we can do to make things better is to use semantic HTML. Now, you've all gone through and done your HTML and CSS modules. This is a bit where I would kind of really love to, if people have any questions, or if anybody had anything they wanted to add in the chat, or to tell me that something I've said isn't right because I've got your timetable wrong. Semantic HTML is one of the best things that we as developers can do to make things more accessible for our users. HTML is the foundation of whatever it is we build, whether we're building in React, which I think we've got coming up after the JavaScript module, whether you're building in React or .NET or PHP, if you're building for the web, you are building with HTML. Unless you're building with Flash, which is a completely different story, and if you're building with Flash in 2024, I'm really, really sorry because no one should have to be doing that anymore. Semantic HTML means we can introduce meaning and context to the content we have inside of our HTML elements. Now, this is compared with presentational HTML. So we have semantic HTML, which introduces meaning and context to the content, whereas presentational HTML will just have it appear on the page. Sometimes it'll have default styling. For example, here are two HTML elements, the B tag and the I tag. These are commonly used to make text bold or to make text italicized. These are presentational elements. So they will often get default browser styling to make them bold and italicized, but they provide no additional meaning or context to that content whatsoever. So if anybody is using assistive technology, like for example, a screen reader, they get no additional information or context behind the content inside of these tags. Even though it's probably bold or italicized for a reason, we should be letting the users who aren't visually seeing the content know that this is more important. Some semantic elements will have default browser styles as well. So just because it's semantic doesn't mean it's not going to get any default styling. These will provide semantic meaning about the content and can let the user know what they're interacting with. For example, the code element is typically used to put a small snippet of code in your content. Not only will it provide styling, generally with a monospaced font and a bit of a background and a different color, not only will provide different styling, but anybody who's using a screen reader will be told, I'm now talking about a code snippet here. The same with the del element, or the del element, which is designated for helping to show that text has been deleted. This will provide some default browser styling, generally with a strike through to let it know that this text has been deleted. But assistive technology like screen readers will also let users know that this is different, that this has a different emphasis on it. Now, I want to go through and do a bit of semantic HTML with you. If you have your computer on that you're able to use, please feel free to work along or to have a look at this later on. So we're going to go through and we're going to switch out some semantic HTML elements onto our page. I'm going to give this like a second for if anybody is grabbing the URL from the bottom, and then we're going to have a look at a couple of elements. Actually, there is chat. Oh no! Okay, I'm going to have to type this. There we go. There's the URL for if anybody wanted to grab it. Now, I'm going to assume that there are a few elements, HTML elements that you already know about. We're not going to cover them. So things like headings and paragraphs, links, images, and lists. Not going to be talking about things like that, but we're going to go through a few different semantic elements that you may not be aware of. I'm going to start off with some overarching elements. These are structure elements which we can use to provide information about the content and the structure of our page. For example, the header, main, and footer element. Now, using semantic container elements can help assistive technologies like screen readers get an understanding of the structure of the content on the page. Can allow people to navigate around a bit more easily. For example, in the header section, they know they're likely to find main navigation, they're likely to find a logo, they might find a search box there as well. The footer section, they're likely to find links to privacy policy or social media profiles and some other information. The main content of the page will probably exist inside of the main element. So the same as visual users will visually scan a page, using semantic layout elements allows users using assistive technologies to quickly scan the content on the page as well. The header element, as the name suggests, represents introductory content on a page. Now, this is different to the head element, which is where we add our scripts and our styles and a whole bunch of other stuff. The header element will visually appear on a page and is typically where we would find the title, navigation menu, search form, that kind of thing. The footer element will generally include our copyright and legal policies. Social media profiles will appear in the footer element, and this will generally appear at the bottom of the page. The main element will then represent the dominant content of the document body, and pretty much everything else will fit inside there. These three elements should all exist on our page and should be the first thing inside of the body. And everything should be inside of one of those containers. So we should have the body, which should contain the header, main, and footer, and everything else should fit inside of them. We have a few more sectioning elements that we can use as well. For example, the article, section, aside, and nav elements. Article element is generally a self-contained section of content that is independently distributable and reusable. That means if you take everything that exists inside of the article element and put it somewhere else by itself, the content inside of it should make sense without everything else on the rest of the page. So if you think of a news article or a blog post, that content should exist inside of an article. And if you take that away, that will make sense without the rest of the page content being included. Fun fact, you can include a header or a footer inside of an article element. For example, a header inside of an article is typically where you would expect to find the article title. The footer could be where you include any author notes. The section element, similar to the article, represents a self-contained section. Now, the thing with a section element is it must contain at least one heading element. It might contain more than one, but it must contain at least one heading element. So if you think of how you might break up a report or a document in Word, a section would contain at least one heading element inside of it. So that would be section 2.4 or something like that. We then have the nav element, which, as the name suggests, is where we would expect to find any navigation links. So we'll often have one in the header and maybe a couple in the footer, and this would include links to other sections of the page or other sections of the website, or links to somewhere completely different. So please somebody tell me if their screens have not changed and if you're really confused about what it is that you can see. So the link that I posted just before, this is our web page, which we're going to go through and add some of our semantic HTML elements on there. Now, if anybody happened to be looking at this page, please feel free to chuck in the chat any particular line numbers where you think you might expect to see any of the semantic HTML elements that we've looked at. So I'm going to start off by looking here, because we've just looked at the nav element. I have a bunch of navigation links. So I reckon this div should actually probably be a nav element. So I'm going to go through and change that through to a nav. Now, this is my page title and my navigation. So this one should probably be a header. And if I come all the way down to the bottom, this one is probably going to be a footer. Make sense? Now, I know inside of my document, I should have 3 elements, the header, main, and footer. So if I've already done my header and my footer, this one should be my main element. And then if I come down, this one seems, this one I have a heading. So these will probably be sections. Got another one here. Section. Section. Oh, no, not that one. This one should be a section. So, making sense so far? I'm going to assume that this is making sense. Either that or everybody's just left their computers and they're going off and having dinner or doing something more fun. So we've gone through and we've had a look at where we can put some of the semantic HTML elements in our web page, and everybody's going to go off and do this afterwards because we've all got the link now, so you can go through and do that. Another important part of semantic HTML is form inputs, in particular labels for form inputs. Is everybody familiar? I'm going to assume everybody is familiar with placeholders on inputs. This is where we will have the label for the input appear inside of the input, and then as soon as you start typing, it will disappear. This is a nice clear design. We see this on a lot of web pages, but the problem with this is, as a sighted user, I'm currently able to see I have an input for name and I have an input for email. If I am a user who is using assistive technology like a screen reader, I get told this one is an edit input, and then I have an edit input. Sometimes I just get told input, input. And if I'm not a visual user, if I'm not a sighted user as well, I don't actually get told the placeholder that's associated with those inputs. So I just know that's input, input. I don't know what kind of information I'm expected to put inside of the inputs. This is why it's really important to have a label for each of our inputs and to link the label with the input. Now, the best way to do this is using the for attribute on the label, which links through to the ID attribute on the input. This means no matter where they appear, on the page, the assistive technology will be able to identify the label, which is the user-friendly label for the input, and it will let people know. So screen readers will then announce this is edit or input name, edit or input email. We then know what kind of content is expected to be put inside of each input. Now this is really important. There are ways that you can go through and visually hide the labels if the design doesn't want to have labels on there, but make sure that there are labels that exist on the page, even if they're not visually available. Another important thing for accessibility, this is why I don't particularly enjoy doing online sessions, because I'm going to assume that everybody is laughing at my amazing joke here, which is text size. Having adequate text size is super important for accessibility. Generally, it's good practice to have 16 pixels as your absolute minimum base text size. If, for example, you're building a website where your primary users are people with vision impairments, you probably want to increase that base text size a little bit more, because you know that's going to be really important. But absolutely bare minimum 16 pixels as your base text size. Next is color contrast. Color contrast, we are talking about the contrast, the difference between the color, the text color, the foreground color, and the background color. Now, there are a whole bunch of different math calculations, which if you really like maths or want to know more about it, you can Google and find out how the whole calculations work. If you do not enjoy doing maths, like I do, I've done the calculations for color contrast. Horrible, complicated, nasty stuff. There are a whole bunch of tools available to help us to look at the color contrast ratios. Now, this is built into most of the browser dev tools, which I really love, which we'll have a look at in a second. The thing I particularly enjoy about this, which is available in Edge, I'm pretty sure even Chrome doesn't have this. This is just available in Edge. It will show us lines, which we'll have a look at in a second, about where we can change colors to meet contrast ratios. So if I go through and have a look at the She Codes website, and it's okay, Kate, when you're watching this back afterwards, I have double checked and I'm not going to out you with some horrible mistake. So if I have a look at my statistics here, 10,000 cupcakes served. If I have a look inside my dev tools, somewhere here, this is the color. There's a little color square next to where the color is. And if I click on that, it will give me a little pop-up here. And this tells me the contrast ratio is 6.38. Now, to meet AA WCAG standard, we need a ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. If we need to meet AAA standard, we need 7 to 1. It gets a little bit more complicated because text that's bigger or bolder, you don't have to have as much contrast because it's a bit easier. Base level is 4.5 to 1 for AA, 7 to 1 for AAA. This will then let me know that it has met AA and AAA standards, which is amazing. And here on my color grid, I'm sure any designers can tell me if I'm using the wrong terminology, that this isn't in fact a color grid. I have 2 lines here. Now, if I go above the line, I know this isn't going to meet AA standard. If I go below the first line, this will meet AA standard. And below the second line will meet AAA standard. This makes it really useful for if we're just having to tweak a color a little bit. It's really great to be able to sit there with the designers and go through, and they can change things around. They can see the exact point it needs to get to pass. So this is a really great tool that I enjoy using. Another Another useful tool, this one I really like as well, which is Who Can Use. Now, this is built by a Perth designer and developer, and I absolutely love using and recommending this tool because not only will this go through and calculate the contrast ratio between the text and the background color, but it will also then simulate various types of color impairments and calculate the resultant ratio of them. For example, if I have like a red and probably green somewhere here, this one's always fun to try and work out. Right, let's go down, going up, somewhere. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here, beautiful color combination. Any designers, I'm sure, will be crying right now because they do not enjoy this. This color combination does technically pass color contrast ratios, 4.58 to 1. That meets AA standard. However, if we then simulate what anybody with red-green, the various types of red-green color blindness would see, they can't properly see the reds or the greens. They can't properly distinguish between them, and the resultant colors doesn't have enough of a contrast ratio. So I enjoy using this tool because it's able to go through and simulate the various types of color impairments, not only types of color blindness, but also other vision impairments like cataracts or glaucoma or low vision, and situational impairments like people who might have glare on their screen or use night shift mode. Abby, there's a really great question, which I'll get to in a second. I just want to quickly finish up on my last color contrast tool recommendation, which this one allows to go through and compare an entire suite of brand colors against one another. We can then go through and go, we've got to meet AA standard, so I want it to be at least 4.5 to 1. This will then let us know what combinations we're able to go through and use. So this is really great tool to share with any designers that you work with because they know which brand colors they can use with which. Now, Abby has asked a question to explain the difference between label and ARIA label for accessibility. Now, ARIA labels, actually, I'm just going to quickly check. I'm pretty sure I don't have it in my slides, but just, no, I do not have it in my slides for this session, because this session's a bit shorter than I normally do. So, ARIA labels you may have come across in more complex controls, which is where we can define a written or a user-friendly label for something that might be more visual. So commonly used version for this is any icon buttons and things like this. This would be an SVG icon of a close icon, so probably a cross, and because anybody who's not visually seeing it doesn't know what this button is for, we would then add the ARIA label close, which would then, sorry, I'm a bit out of practice with presenting. I've not spoken for an hour straight in a while. The ARIA label would be announced by users using assistive technologies like screen readers to users to let them know that this button has a label of close, so they would understand that this button is going to close a thing. Now, this is really useful because it is read by screen readers. However, the reason why I don't generally recommend people using it is because ARIA labels and any other attributes that exist, so the attributes are any bits here on the HTML element, these aren't passed by any translation software. So if, for example, somebody who doesn't speak the primary language that you're writing the content in would go through and access the web page, and probably Chrome or whatever browser they're using will pop up and go, hey, do you want us to translate this for you? When they go through and translate it, those ARIA labels and any content that exists inside of those attributes aren't then translated. So generally, I would recommend having, instead of an ARIA label, just having a bit of content that exists inside the button that is visually hidden. So the button still looks like an icon, but the content inside of the button, even though it's visually hidden, can then be passed by any translation software, if that makes sense. If anybody else had any other questions or wanted to know more about that, please pop in the chat. Or if I've just made no sense whatsoever, I apologize, Javier, I swear I'm trying to explain it. Doing my best to try and explain it. All right, now, color contrast. We've just looked at color contrast. Yeah, okay. I don't use PowerPoint very often, so I've forgotten where the controls are. So we had a look at how we can check the color contrast, and who can use is really great. Now, similar to color contrast, we also want to be really careful about using color for state changes or using color to indicate information. Now, if we have a look at this form, we can see a very over-the-top use of color to let the user know whether or not a field has valid or invalid content. For example, I would probably know that my name is correct because that field's gone green. I know my email is incorrect, it's invalid, because that one's gone red. So I know I need to go through and fix this. Now, if I have type of color blindness that affects seeing the difference between red and green, I might see something like this. And now my form's not submitting. I know one of these fields is wrong, but I don't know which one has an error, because the only thing I'm able to see is there are two colors. I can't tell the difference between red or green. Now, I've made these backgrounds red and green to be really obvious. Most of the time, we just have border color change. I couldn't even tell you what color the borders of those inputs are supposed to be. So we need to be really careful about using color to indicate state change or other kinds of information. This is why if we have errors for things like this, making sure we also have a visually available error that can be consumed and is made available to assistive technology, as well as just showing things with color. This is also really important when working with a wide range of different cultures and international users, because color may mean different things to different people depending on how color is interpreted by different cultures. So it's really important to make sure that we are providing iconography and text alternatives to our errors rather than just relying on color alone. Now, if you would like to go through and have a look at the various different types of color blindness or what different vision impairments, if you look at the accessibility tab in the dev tools, there are different ones available for Chromium and Firefox, so I recommend switching between the two. We can go through and simulate. Sorry, it's just, I swear, it's really hot in my office despite the fact that the aircon's on now. We can go through and simulate the different kinds of vision impairments and see what our web page looks like to those users. This is really important when we go through and do hover or focus styles as well. So these are some of the common ways of doing focus styles. We might or hover styles, we might change the background, might change the underline, the border, or change the color of an element. But if we take the color away, it can be a lot more difficult for users to see a slight color change. This is why it's really important to make sure that we're not just relying on a color change to show a change in state and we're using something else, or if we are using a color change, it's a really obvious one. For example, flipping the background and the foreground colors, something that is easy for people to see even with vision impairments. Next, important thing to do is keyboard navigation. Now this is a little bit boring for me to demo because you can't actually see me typing on my keyboard, but something I encourage you all to try out on your own later. This means loading up a web page on your computer, grab your keyboard and put your mouse away. Navigate around the web page on your keyboard, try using tab and enter and arrow keys. See if you're able to go through and fill in forms. See if you're able to click on things, navigate around. See if you actually know where it is that you are on a page. So it's really great to get in the habit of using your keyboard to navigate around the pages that you're building, because a lot of users will use keyboards as their primary method of navigation. Both people who are using assistive technologies will use keyboards for navigation, but also people with mobility impairments, if they've got limited use of their hand or limited control. For example, people with Parkinson's may not be able to control a mouse or a cursor or a touchpad, and it's much easier for them to press on keys on a keypad. Focus indicators. So this goes hand in hand with keyboard navigation. The same as we have hover styles for if we're hovering our cursor over an interactive element. If we're using a keyboard to navigate, we have focus styles. A commonly added style to our web pages is this, which turns off all of the focus styles because people don't like what they look like. It's a horrible thing to do. So please make sure that you're taking into account focus styles when styling your web pages, and try to have something that looks on brand and looks the same as the rest of the stuff, but is a visual and accessible focus style. Just a couple more things before we'll see if there are any more questions. Avail oneself of unostentatious vernacular. Really appreciate the laughing emojis coming up here. I'm going to assume everybody else just doesn't know where to find them and everyone is laughing at my clearly hilarious joke. Anybody who doesn't know what this means, I don't know what this means. Use plain language. Most of the time, there is absolutely no need whatsoever to use long, complicated words. One of the best things we can do for accessibility is to use plain language, make it easier for everybody to be able to consume and understand the content that we're writing. Now, I have a whole bunch of tools that I recommend. I can pop them into Slack afterwards, or I think the slides will get shared out if anybody wants to grab them afterwards. HTMLreference.io has a really great list of, I don't think it's all, but it's most of the HTML elements. This is really great to have a look at different HTML elements there are, making sure that we're using the right one for the content that we're using, whether or not there's a more semantic option available. We also have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. These ones, unfortunately, the WCAG guidelines are not massively accessible to read. So these are written specifically for accessibility consultants and professionals to read. but there are a lot of really great explanations of them. They're a bit easier to understand. There's a really great book and webpage available, which is Inclusive Components. Now, this will go through a bunch of code examples on building common components. This is the one thing I enjoy about doing stuff at home. So this has a whole bunch of code samples of different components that we will commonly build and how we can make sure that we're building them accessibility. So like collapsible sections and content sliders and notifications. There is a web page with them available as well, but I like getting nice books. Accessibility for Everyone, also a really great book about accessibility and really great explanation of a lot more of these concepts in depth. I also have an accessibility course online, which is now available free. So if anybody would like to learn a little bit more, we can do that. And I have a blog post on my blog as well. Also then have the contrast tools, which we talked about. That's the rest of my slides. So do we have any more questions? I will sit here awkwardly for a little bit. While people ask any questions. Otherwise, you are free to go and enjoy the rest of your evenings, whether that is studying or doing more prep for Plus program. Thank you very much, Fira. I'm really glad you enjoyed the session. I'm also very excited that you're on front end. I always really enjoy the front end stuff. Unfortunately, I often am not able to come and help out on that stuff as much. Apparently, Kate does not take my schedule into consideration when scheduling her programs, which is really rude. I think the last time I said that to her as well, she pointed out that she was actually not in the country for half the stuff, so it's not just me.
Which is why you've got me and my awkward introduction. So there you go. That was amazing, Amy. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I've just seen there's one more question from Abby. I'm just wondering how to balance design and contrast. That one's kind of hard because I'm not a designer, so I can't fully pick color combinations that look really good but also have enough contrast. I would say probably the best thing to do is working really closely with designers and looking at those tools and going through and just tweaking. Sometimes it's just slight tweaks to different things, or even having a few different versions. So when I got my personal branding redone a few years ago, I told my designer that I wanted to have some colors that worked well with light background and some with dark background so that I could do different color modes. And she got really upset because she had these beautiful bright colors that didn't work well with dark or light for the most part. So I have three versions. I have three versions of each color. One, which is the nice pretty color, which we use in graphics, where the contrast isn't important. One which works really well with a light background, and one which works really well with a dark background. So depending on where I'm using it, I may be like, I've got three different versions of red, and I can use them where I need to. So yeah, it's just about tweaking that. And I know there's probably a few, I think we've generally got a few designers in the cohorts, so you've got a bit more experience with it. But the best thing I've found is having that conversation with designers and showing them a lot of the resources as well, and getting them to have a look at, okay, well, we don't need something that's horrendous. We just need to tweak it a little bit. But when they're involved in the process and they understand the importance of it, I found it's one of the best things that we can do.
Beautiful. Excellent. Okay. We got any more questions? If not, I will end the recording and wish everybody an amazing evening. And thanks again, Amy. That's just awesome. Just wondering. Oh, yeah, we good? Great. Thanks, everybody.